Hey, so today we're going to be building a hover effect. I actually just added this to our pricing cards over on buildui.com, and I wanted to show you how I built it. So we're going to be doing that today. And if you want to go straight to the final code, check for a link in the description to a recipe over there, and you can see how we do it. But without further ado, let's get right into it. I've got a simple recreation of our card right here, and this is all just static JSX and Tailwind, and we want to add that hover treatment to this. So for the first step, let's just come and work on getting the radial gradient on the background. Now this div right here is kind of the card, and this is the container, and this div kind of has all the content. So let's just go ahead and add an invisible class to hide that for now while we work on the background. And whenever I have kind of complex interactive elements like this, I like to go ahead and just make a new div. So we'll make a div, we'll make this absolute, inset 0, and let's just give it a background of white, which takes up the whole page. But if we come up here and drop a relative in, now we'll see it hugs the card, and we can add overflow hidden so we see the border radius. Now we don't actually want a white background, we want to use a radial gradient. So let's come and add an inline style of background, and I'll make this a radial gradient. This is just a CSS function that gives us a radial gradient. If you've never used it before, you can just add colors, and it's basically just going to create an ellipse for us here that fills the container. And we can see the 3 stops, green, red, blue, and it kind of fades between them evenly by default. So this is kind of the basic use of radial gradient, but of course we can customize this. For example, we can have just a 2-color stop, but instead of red, let's make this transparent. And there we can kind of see our background color is bleeding through the edges because of this transparent color stop. And we can also change kind of how far along each color stop is in the overall background. They start with 0 and 100% like this, but if we were to bring this down to 90% or 80%, we see it kind of moves that second color stop closer towards the center. So maybe we can go with 80, leave this as the default as 0. And instead of green, let's just use this nice blue RGB color. And lastly here, we can see that this is an ellipse because our container is taller than it is wide. And we can specify a shape right here and just say we want a circle. And now we're going to see a perfect circle here, and that looks pretty nice. So we'll keep tweaking the design of this once we get the content back. But next, let's talk about how we would actually get the center of our gradient to follow the mouse. Well, it turns out that this radial gradient function accepts a position parameters right after the circle here. So it defaults kind of to the middle, 50-50. But if we say at, we can actually specify X and Y positions. So if we said 0 pixels and 0 pixels, that's going to put it in the top right. And we can move it over by 100 pixels or down by 300 pixels. So maybe you see where I'm going with this. If we know the pixel location of our mouse pointer as we move it across the div, and we update the X and Y position of the center of our gradient, then we'll achieve that spotlight effect, and the gradient should follow our mouse. So how can we get the X and Y position of our mouse cursor when we're moving it over the div? Well, let's come here to our root card div. Again, that's this one. We want to know when we're moving the mouse over this entire thing. So let's add an on mouse move event handler, and we'll write a handle mouse move callback here. And this will be a function that takes an event, and let's go ahead and log that event. So let's come over, open up our console, and check this out. We get this event every time we move our mouse. If we take a look, we'll see a client X and client Y property, which tells us exactly how many pixels from the left side we are, as well as how many pixels from the top that we are. So let's come here and grab client X and client Y and just log these two. And let's zoom out so we can see this whole thing. And now we can see those values updating with each mouse move event. So pretty cool, pretty easy way to get the mouse position. But if you'll recall, The center of the gradient is actually with respect to the top left portion of this div. So if we were to go back to 0 pixels and 0 pixels here, we'll see that this centers our circle of the gradient to the top left. But if I move my mouse right around here, we're going to see these values don't look like 0, 0. They're actually 167 over and 27 down. And that's because the client X and client Y properties are actually relative to the viewport. So if we could get the actual position of this div in the DOM from the top left, we could subtract those. So how might we do that? Well, let's come back to our event handler and let's give this a type actually, so we have a little bit more information. This is a mouse event and we want to import that from React. And now we're going to see some other useful properties here. And the one we want is current target. So let's go ahead and log current target. And if we come back and mouse move, we're going to see that this gives us the div from which the event was emitted, which in our case is the card. And if I go ahead and reveal this in the elements panel, we'll see it right there. And now I can reference this with $0 in the dev tools. This is a DOM element, and DOM elements have a method called getBoundingClientRect. And this handy method is really useful when you're measuring things, but also when you're trying to see how a particular element is laid out. We can see it has the width and the height, but it also has the top and the left. And these values are how much offset the element is from the top left of the viewport. They're kind of wonky right now because I'm zoomed in, but if we were to come clear the console, go ahead and log getBoundingClientRect every time we move. Now we're going to see top and left. We see it's 56 pixels from the top, which looks right, and 166 pixels from the left. So let's go ahead and store these into a bounds object. And our X position is going to be our client X minus bounds.left. And we can just go ahead and destructure left and top, use it just like this, and then we'll get the Y position with client Y minus top. And let's go ahead and log this. X position, Y position. Clear the console. And check this out. When we go up to the top left, we go all the way down to 0, 0. So now we have the position of the mouse cursor relative to the box, which means if we can get these values right here, then our gradient should follow our mouse. So how can we do that? Well, we need some React state. Let's use state. We'll call this mouse position, and we'll give it an object with X of 0 and Y of 0 to start. Go ahead and import useState. And now right here, let's set mouse position. X will be X position, Y will be Y position. And now that we're updating state, let's use state down here in our radial gradient. So this is going to be mouse position.x, and this is going to be mouse position.y. VS Code went ahead and turned this into a template string, so we can just use that interpolation. And check this out. Look at that. That's pretty cool, right? Just some React state, updating it with an event handler using the bounds and the client X and client Y from that event. And we kind of have a spotlight going on here. So this is pretty neat. You'll kind of see that this circle seems to be changing sizes. This is just because it's using a default size. It kind of fills the parent, but we can actually hard code a size right here. So I could make this like a 200 pixel circle. And there you go. You see it kind of following our mouse cursor. Maybe we'll make it something like 400 for now. So this is pretty cool. And this basic idea is kind of the idea behind any spotlight effect. But if you've used React before, your spidey sense might be going on right now. If I were to come here and drop in a console.log of render, and we come back and open up the console, check this out. Our component is re-rendering a whole bunch of times. And even if I just kind of move this mouse really slowly, we're just jacking up the renders right there. We've already rendered this component 500 times. Now React is fast, and this is simple. And even if I were to come in here and show the content, you know, it doesn't show any signs of real problems right now. But actually, if I move my mouse, I'm not sure how much it comes through the video, but you can kind of feel a little bit of a lag, a little bit of a delay. And really with anything that is interactive or animated like this, an effect on an interactive element like this, that's updating maybe 60 frames a second or close to that, it's best not to have your React components re-render that much. Overall, you should not be thinking about React re-renders, but there's libraries like Framer Motion that are designed for kind of highly updating components with interactions and animations like this that you should use that can update these properties and styles outside of React renders. So let me show you how easy this refactor is to take this from updating React all of these hundreds of times to using Framer Motion. So let's come over here, and instead of React state, we are going to use motion value. This comes from Framer Motion, and these motion values need to be strings or numbers. So let's just make a mouse X motion value, and we'll make a second one mouse Y so that these can both just be numbers like that. Now down here, instead of calling set state, we are going to call mouse X.set, and we'll set that to the new X position. And we'll do the same thing for mouse Y, and we can go ahead and get rid of this. So now we have the X and Y position in these two motion values right here. Let's come down to our style tag and change this with mouse X and change this with mouse Y. Now, if we save this and we take a look at the DOM here, we're not going to see our gradient anymore. And if I inspect this, we're going to see a hint as to why. Here is our absolute div for our background. We can see style background radial gradient. And then right where we're interpolating mouse X and mouse Y, we just see object. And this is precisely because these are motion values. They can't be used directly within React's render function. But check this hook out. Framer Motion has a use motion template hook. We can drop right in here. It takes in exactly the same template string, but it knows how to infer these motion values. And the only other thing we need to change, we'll see TypeScript is telling us very helpfully here that this doesn't work. But if we change this to a motion.div, the error goes away. Come back and refresh. And look at this. Buttery smooth, updating at 60 frames a second, no problem. And if I open up the console, this is the best part. Our component only rendered the one time. We see once on the server and then once on the client. That's because of Next.js. But every time we move this, there's no unnecessary work going on. Framer Motion is designed to work at 60 frames a second. And again, it doesn't interfere with any of the logic in our React component. So I thought this was a pretty cool demonstration. If you see my channel, you know how much I love this library. It just continues to impress me. But this is basically almost a transparent refactor, really. It's just you need to create these motion values and then call set right here. So let's come back and just kind of button this up and add some polish. I'm going to delete this render call. And let's go ahead and inline these. And we don't need use state anymore. And let's go ahead and bring back our content so we can see what this looks like. First, we can't select the text or interact with a lot of these elements. That's because we've added this div that's absolute right on top. Let's just go ahead and add pointer events none. This is a good class to add to interactive elements like this, so it doesn't interfere with the actual content. And second, this blue is it's pretty bright. Let's bring down the opacity, maybe 15%, something like that. And this is much more subtle, much nicer. Let's also hide our radial gradient div when we're not hovered over parent. So we can make it hidden with just opacity 0. And then when we hover the parent, we want to bring it back to opacity 100. And we can use Tailwind's group utility so that we can add a group hover class that brings opacity back to 100, just like that. And let's add some transition to this. And let's slow it down a little bit, maybe duration 300. And this is starting to look really nice. More subtle effect, you know? Kind of like what you would see in Linear or some of the other sites that use this treatment. I even think we can make our gradient a little bit bigger. And yeah, this is looking really slick. One final little piece of polish. If you were to zoom in here, you'll see that our gradient just extends to the border. And so it's not really affecting the border color. It would be cool if the border changed close to where our gradient was, where our mouse was, right? Well, right now, our background is inset 0, which is going to carry it just to the edge of the border. So there's a nice little version of inset. We can go -1 pixel out so that we kind of extend underneath that border. And let's just make this border transparent. And even though it's transparent, we still are not seeing our background extend. This is because we still have overflow hidden right here. That's going to cut it off within the content area inside of the border. So let's get rid of that. Okay, now we see our gradient background extending the full size, but we've lost the rounding. So let's just duplicate this rounded 3XL class right here. And now it looks like it's extending to the edge of the border. So instead of transparent, before we had gray 700, and check that out. You can kind of see it's very subtle, but if we were to zoom out here, because our absolute div is on top of the parent div here, it's rendering on top because of absolute positioning. We have this nice, real subtle glow of the borders whenever the gradient gets close. So I think that ends up as a really nice touch, really nice little piece of polish there. And that's it. That is the effect. So hope you like that. If you've never seen use motion value before, it can kind of seem a little scary in the docs when you first see it, but really just think of them as little state bags that you can set and update. You can actually get their velocity from, you can see how they change over time, and you can use them with other elements and APIs from Framer Motion, but they update outside of React. So they're basically kind of like React State, but they work outside of React, and Framer Motion elements like motion.div take care of kind of interfacing, crossing that gap, and bridging the data changes from Framer Motion into React. And it just ends up with really nice treatments like this. The only other thing I wanted to mention about this is, I think this effect works nicely with this card because the user, is kind of exploring and reading this, and the glow kind of draws their attention. It helps them focus on which part of the card they're looking at and maybe eventually click a button or interact with it. But this hover effect can be overused. So just because you can do this doesn't mean you should use it gratuitously. You don't want to throw this on every button, every interactive element. I think it works really well with elements that maybe are laid out in a grid, and you just want to draw the user in a little bit more and help them explore the content that you've shown them. So that is it for this one. Hope you enjoyed that. Check a link in the description for the code, and I will see you in the next one.